Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to start talking about the major secular ethical theories. And just a little bit of good news, Kino is here with me as I record. He's over here if you hear him breathing or snoring in the background. All right, so I just want to remind you of what we talked about last time, and that was the history of philosophy timeline. And this was to give us some context as we move into looking at normative ethical theories. So just a refresher, we looked at the logical options. The first being reason is ontological and there is no God, and this is God in theism. The second movement was reason is ontological and God exists. The third was reason is not ontological and God does not exist. And the fourth is reason is not ontological and God does not exist. 4 logical options. And our ethical theories will come from a smattering of each of these, but mostly will fall in this fourth category as we go down. So some of the things we talked about were pragmatism in ethics, what works, teleological ethics, goal-oriented ethics, virtue ethics, the natural moral law, stoicism, divine command theory. There was a lot of divine command theory in this medieval period. And then ethical egoism. As we start moving over, we'll start to see some theories that we're going to talk about today. Naturalism, deontology, utilitarianism. We'll talk about vitalism a little bit. And then we see a lot of pragmatism and utilitarianism. So we're going to talk about the ethical theories today. So I'm going to get that handout up. So I've made this handout called the Normative Ethical Theories. And we're just going to go over each one. And your handout has links in blue to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And that is a very well-known source for philosophy, and this will give you literature that you can read more about each theory, and I would encourage you to do that. So here's just about ethical theories in general. So remember, I guess I should review a little bit. We have talked about ethics is based on human nature, or our view of the good is based on our view of human nature, which is based on our metaphysics, what is real. So remember the house. The bottom is our epistemology, how do I know? The foundation is metaphysics, what is real? And then the house is our ethics, what is the good life? And ethics is dependent upon our view of what is real, because part of what is real is what is a human being. Now, we talked about different levels of human nature, and I just want to review that a little bit. So at the bottom, remember, the most basic level is humans are rational, political animals. We're rational, and the rational is to rule over our communal life together, the polis, and our animality, our appetites, our bodily needs. So reason rules. And we said that's universal. All humans are rational political animals. But then we also talked about presuppositions as the next level. And presuppositions are our basic beliefs, our metaphysics. And we don't agree here. This is where there's diversity of belief. So we have different presuppositions, different basic beliefs. Either all is eternal or only some is eternal. And then we have different personalities, intellect, emotion, will, and we each have those in us, and there's an order with one being dominant. And then we talked about different backgrounds, and this has to do with things like our socioeconomic background, our race or ethnicity, gender identity, education, generation, birth order, all these differences. And then we talked about uniqueness, what makes you, you. And then we talked about mood. So there's a lot of diversity in human personality, and there's also unity. And it's at that basis of unity that we want to find an ethical theory for all humans. So these normative ethical theories are going to pick some aspect of human nature and develop the theory based on that aspect of human nature. And so we have to see, first, is there rational justification for picking this theory? Remember, rational justification is having good reasons for the answer to the question, what is the good? So is there rational justification? And is this the most basic element of human nature? Or is there something more basic that we should dig down to form an ethical theory? Also, these ethical theories are called secular because they don't have God. So on our timeline, those two columns that are, actually there are 3 columns without God. Two columns without God and one with God, but it's like maybe God is more like a deistic God. He doesn't interact. So secular has to do with the world, which is not making reference to any supra-natural being. Supra meaning above nature. So these are going to say, okay, here's what a human is as part of the natural world. Here's our ethical theory. And remember, these theories are meant to be objective. They're not just relative theories. Maybe a couple could be skewed that way because it's based on the individual. But theories aren't necessarily meant to be relative because they are trying to theorize about all humans. Okay, so we have to see which one does reason lead us to, if any. Maybe reason doesn't lead us to any of these. All right, let's look at each one, and I'll just briefly read it, talk about it, and some of these will have videos that go with them from other sources that will be in our class shell. So there will be one, for example, on Plato that I'll have for you to watch, an outside video, not one of my videos. All right, so the first one is contemplation. And contemplation, you can think about emphasizing the intellect, the thinking part of us. So this is going to be an ethical theory based on the intellect. And this theory says the good is only found through the exercise of the intellect. This view is exemplified by Plato's view that the good may only be attained by the mind apart from any sensory perception. All right, so there's 2 references here, the allegory of the cave and your soul is a chariot. The allegory of the cave is this idea that it's an allegory that Plato gives. I'm going to give you a video to watch, but I will briefly summarize. He has this allegory in the Republic, which is his ethics text, basically. It's about the ideal city-state. He says, imagine there are people that are chained up from birth in a cave facing the wall of the cave. Behind these people, there's a wall, and there are other people walking back and forth on the wall with something like puppets. And they're puppets, and there's a light source behind them. And the puppets are casting shadows on the cave wall. And the people that are chained up in the cave are only able to see the shadows on the cave wall. They can hear some voices, and so they start to make inferences that these shadows are telling them something. It's like a story. And so they assume that the appearance of the shadows is reality. And so they start to make predictions about what's going to happen next. And it's almost like this is what life is, the shadows on the wall. Well, eventually one of those people that's chained up is unchained and forcibly removed from the cave. He's taken out, and as he's going up some stairs to go outside of the cave, he's coming into the light of the sun. It's very bright, and it's also shocking because he didn't know about this world outside of the cave. So 2 things are happening. The cave is not reality, and it's very bright. And his eyes have to adjust. He's been in the dark for so long. And so he comes outside of the cave. He's able to see again, but only in stages. So he can see reflections in water. And then he can start to look up and see birds and trees, and then he could see the stars at night. And eventually his eyes can adjust to seeing the sun. And he's very happy about this because he sees that the sun is the source of all of this life and radiance around him. And he's very happy because he sees reality for the first time. Now, he also remembers his life in the cave and his friends that he left back there. And he decides he should probably go back to them and tell them about this world outside of the cave. So he makes his way back into the cave. It's dark in there. Again, this is jarring because he can't see as he enters into this darkness. And the friends are still there making predictions about these shadows on the wall. And he tells them, friends, these shadows are only that. They're shadows. It's not real. What's outside of this cave is real. You should come and see. And they are trying to pull him back into their world to make predictions about the shadows, and he can't do it because his eyes aren't adjusted to the darkness. And so they start to make fun of him and say, you've ruined your eyesight by going out there. And they also decide, we're never going to let anyone else go out there again because this is harmful. And so they want to kill him. Now, what is this allegory of the cave about? Really, the cave is the world of our senses. The chains represent our senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And our senses have us chained to the world of appearances, the empirical world. And we never rise above the empirical world to contemplating what's higher than. So when I mentioned the supranatural, the cave is the natural world that we live in. The supranatural is what's beyond mere physical appearances. And Plato thought there was this realm of the ideas, the forms, he called them. And the form of all forms is the good. And you can only get there through thinking about it. And so the sun in that allegory is the good, the form of the good. And your leaving the cave is not a physical movement of your body, but a mental movement of your mind to contemplate reality. And reality is not just this physical world. This physical world has forms, but those forms should bring you to the form of all forms. And he thought this is the good. And you can only get there through reason, contemplating. Now, he gets a little mystical about this, and it's not that the good is clear to all people. It's hard to do this, and only the philosophers can do this. And even there, people want to kill the philosophers. So that's the allegory of the cave, and that's contemplation. Now, the soul as a chariot is another allegory that Plato uses to talk about reason ruling ourself. And I just want to tell this to you because I think it's a very good analogy, and if we were in class, I would draw it on the board, a picture. But he says, imagine your soul is a chariot. Okay, now you have to use your imagination for this. A chariot has wheels, it's pulled by horses. This chariot is being pulled by two horses. You are the driver. So you're driving a chariot. There are two horses. One horse is representing your appetites, and it's a little bit unruly. The other horse is representing the spirited part of you, the will. And you are reason, driving your appetites and your will, and you're trying to get all of these to coordinate. And when they coordinate, your reason, your appetites, and your will, then you have a harmonious soul. Now, he also thinks that the soul is an image of what the city-state should be like. A harmonious city-state would have the philosophers ruling the masses who are going for their appetites, and the courageous ones who are like the protectors of the city-state, maybe the army and the police force. something like that. Now, your soul can get out of balance. Maybe you're letting your appetites rule you. So you need virtues for each of these aspects of your soul. Wisdom is the virtue that guides your reason. Temperance is the virtue that guides your appetites. Courage is the virtue that guides your will. And when you have those in balance, it's called justice. You have a just soul. And when the city-state has all the parts in unity working together, that is considered a just and harmonious state, city-state. So there's just a little picture of Plato, what he thinks about your soul and how virtues should rule your soul. But the chief virtue is reason here. Okay, so you can think about this. It is, again, a view that says reason is ontological, but there is no God. The things that are permanent are your soul, which I just talked about, the three aspects of your soul, and the forms. And the form of the good is the form of all forms. It is the best. Now, he also thinks your soul was in the presence of the good before it was in this body. He has this view of reincarnation of the soul. And it's a little bit curious how your soul got in this body. He thinks bodies are evil and the soul is good. Now, your soul got in this body because that appetite horse got out of control. So you were drugged down to earth following your appetites. And now the goal is to remember that you are a philosopher and philosophers contemplate the good. Right? So that's contemplation. As far as an ethical theory goes, it's probably not very popular right now, mostly because reason is ontological is not very popular, and dualism is not popular either. But this idea of a sort of mystical connection with the good is popular, and it is in some religious circles as what's called the beatific vision. And the beatific vision is a vision of God himself in the afterlife. So Plato creeps into some theism in that way. Okay, but that's another class and another story. The next theory we want to talk about is deontology. Now, we mentioned deontology in general, that it is putting one's duty or virtue as the good or the goal of life, do the right thing. But deontology becomes an ethical theory in its own right, particularly through Immanuel Kant. Now, I will also give you a link to a video about Kant and his ethics. But let's read through this together. Deontology says that the good is achieved by an act of the will, notice an aspect of human nature, that is guided by reason without consideration of our desires. So think about this. We talked about intellect, emotion, will as three aspects of our personality. Kant is going to put the emphasis on the will and reason guiding the will. But willing has to do with action, doing the right thing. So Immanuel Kant, here's his date, and Deontology has a link, you can read more about it. Kant believed that one ought only to act on those rules of action which one can will to become universal laws. And this is called the categorical imperative. Now I'll show you a video on the categorical imperative, and I'm going to ask you to know what that is for the quiz. What is Kant's categorical imperative? But he thought that you should only will those rules of action which you could make universal. So if I were to say no one should eat onions, is that something I could make universal? Probably not. What would be the rational justification for that? But if I say no one should murder anybody else, murder is wrong, Could I justify that as a universal law? Kant thinks you can, because he would say, look at yourself. You wouldn't want to be murdered by another. So when you put yourself in the shoes of another person, you could see they wouldn't want to be murdered either. Any person you choose, you can put yourself in those shoes and see they don't want to be murdered either. So we could make this into a universal law. Now we're going to borrow this idea of a universal law from Immanuel Kant later in our class when we look at a moral law. Now Kant thought there was a moral law, and we're going to see, is there a moral law that can be universalized? He thinks there is, and it's based on the will. So I'm going to let you read up on deontology and watch the video on Immanuel Kant. I think we have time for existentialism. Let's talk about existentialism. Now, if you remember, I might have to flip back to our timeline. We have existentialism on here somewhere. Here it is, existentialism. It is in this, we have Sartre here, and it's in this category of there's reason is not ontological and there is no God. So you have to keep that in mind as the background to this theory. And you can see that it's a recent theory. Sartre is 1905 to 1980. That's within my lifetime. So here's the existentialism. It says the good is achieved by an act of the will, notice an emphasis on the will, determining the good independent of any essential human nature. So let's think about that. If reason is not ontological, reason does not apply to being, and you also add that the natural material world is all that exists, and that material world is constantly changing, then things do not have a nature. Things are in flux. So Sartre is going to say there is no human nature. You make your own nature. You create your nature. He says human beings are the sole determiners of meaning. We determine meaning. There is no intrinsic meaning out there in the world to be grasped. It's what we create. We create meaning. Now, this is very popular right now, right? This sounds like, yeah, everybody thinks that. He would say, by taking full responsibility for one's choices, human beings may achieve authentic existence. So you are free. You are free to choose. And there's no right or wrong in what you choose. But once you choose, there are consequences that you have to live with. So I'll give you an example of what my professor once told us. He said, imagine there's a lady on the side of the road, an old lady, and it's dark and raining and storming out, and she's walking in the rain, and you think to yourself, I could give her a ride, but you could also splash her, big puddle. You could also run her over, or you could also just ignore her and keep driving. All of these are morally equivalent. Once you do one of those things, though, you are responsible for what happens next. So let's say you run her over, and society thinks running old ladies over is wrong, then you will have to deal with the consequences of the society that you live in. But your choices aren't right or wrong. You make yourself through the choices that you make, and it's by an act of the will. So notice the emphasis is on the will. And you're going to notice that in that fourth category, either the will or the emotions are emphasized. Why? Because reason is ruled out already. All right, so I'm going to give you a video to watch on existentialism as well. It's a fun one. I call it nihilism light. When you study Friedrich Nietzsche and he talks about nihilism, meaninglessness, he does recognize if there is no nature of things, if there is no human nature, then we pretty much are left with a meaningless condition. And he's not super happy about it. But I think existentialism says, yeah, that's true. There is no meaning, but we could make meaning. So, okay. It's still saying there isn't any meaning. So that's a view that is popular now. I would say a lot of college students try it on. I'm not sure it's very livable. I'll let you try it. I was an existentialist for a while, and then I let it go because I was convinced something was better. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Next time we're going to come back and talk about virtue ethics.